Okay, so we have a question from Juan. Using Git and GitHub for personal projects where one is the only developer seems very straightforward. However, in a dev team, it's a completely different story. What's the standard workflow in these cases? Right. So are you asking how you should sort of organize like repositories on GitHub, permissions and these kinds of things? Or are you asking how do you collaborate on a given project / repo? Okay, let's maybe start with how you actually organize a repo and the permission. So if you're using GitHub, you have the option to either have a repo owned by a single person, or you can have it owned by an organization. Okay, so that can you also see that? Actually, let me. Okay, so there we go. So that's my GitHub profile, and you can see that I'm a member of like a ton of different organizations, and these are a different way of organizing repos, right? So I have my own repos here, which are under my GitHub account. So I can give other people access by adding them as collaborators. So if I go to settings, I can add probably manage access. Wow, this has changed since I last. Oh yeah. By the way, if you haven't enabled two-factor authentication for GitHub, please do that. I actually have different ways. So I actually have a physical security key, which sits in my USB port, which I can tap to authenticate. I do that for work, but you can use it for GitHub as well. The other option is to use an authenticator app on your phone or get a text message. Essentially, that just gives you another way of securing your account. So no one can go in just by brute forcing your password or guessing it if it's, oh yeah, use a password manager and use a random password as well. Sorry, that was a bit of a sidebar. So yeah, so here I could invite someone as a collaborator, and then they would be able to write to my repo. So it's a public repo, so everyone can read it, but only I can push to it. So that's model one. Let's go back. And by the way, if you want to message in the chat or tell me like if I'm boring you all or if that is actually useful. So then let me jump to one of my organizations that I'm a member of. So like say PyData London, which is the PyData meetup group in London, and we have a bunch of repos under that organization. For instance, our website, and the collaboration settings here are much broader because you can. So these would be like the settings for the individual repos, but you can set roles at the organization level. So if I go back to the organization here, then we can set up teams and we can give them. So apparently this is now a legacy team. So so this team, a bunch of people in it, and they have permission to. So they're kind of org admins, so they can create repos, they can change settings and all kinds of things. But there's another team, the website editors, and they have sort of more restricted permission. So they have one repository to which they have write access, which is just the website. So that is a way. If you are using a personal repo, then a common flow is. Let me go back to myself. So if you look at my repos, a lot of these are actual what GitHub calls forks. So for instance, in this repo, I forked this repo because I wanted to make a contribution, and GitHub allows you to do this and then send a pull request to someone. So like you can't really. Oh yeah, Despa is a good point. There is that's also a new-ish thing. Okay, this is not. Okay, let me jump to a different repo where this makes sense. I think I should actually have. So this GitHub org. This is back from when I did my PhD, and this is the GitHub org of my research group, and they're still working on this. So I think in this repo, I presume they may have even set this up. Okay, they haven't, but oh no, they have. Yeah, they have a branch protection rule. So okay, Pavel asked what are branch protection rules. So a branch protection rule sets specific requirements for modifying a given branch. So in this case, we have a branch protection rule on the master branch, and usually you want those to enforce specific workflows. So for instance, if you have like master, or like as it's now usually called main because of the connotations that the word master has, like GitHub recommends, or like it's good practice to call your main development branch just main. Well, sorry, not your main development branch, the main branch of your repository, which is kind of the default branch that someone would be looking at, or that that someone would be where essentially where your releases are, I suppose is the way to put it. And exactly to the point that Juan made, that you don't want people to step on each other's toes, and you don't want you may want to have different roles in your collaboration workflow, where, for instance, there's certain gatekeepers, like only certain gatekeepers can push to the master branch, or you want to enforce that you have to actually send a pull request, which is then reviewed and then merged into your main branch. So in this repo, for instance, yeah, this is exactly the rule that I was thinking of. So for this branch, you can't push to it directly, but you must issue a pull request, and there has to be at least one reviewer that has approved that change before it can be merged. And presumably, all right, yeah. And the other thing is that you can require automatic checks to run against this pull request, which is also good practice. So, for instance, here we've configured to run a linter, to build the documentation, to actually build the code itself, and then any conversations that have been happening on the pull request must be resolved, and also only a certain number of people, which I call gatekeepers, they can actually push. And in this case, because a pull request is required, they are the ones that can merge the pull request. So they can't, like, even they can't push directly, but they're the ones that can merge a pull request. So maybe we can look at an example. Let's look at a recently merged pull request. Update documentation dependencies. I guess that was uncontroversial. Okay, yeah, that was uncontroversial. Of course, what if you are one of the gatekeepers, even though you still have to issue a pull request, but since you can also merge a pull request, it effectively isn't a bar on any of the gatekeepers, because they can just issue the pull request and then merge. So let's look at something more interesting. Next one. Okay, so this one's a bit more interesting. So here you had someone who is not a gatekeeper, because the gatekeepers are file-direct-core, if you remember from earlier. You don't allow admins to merge. Everyone is equal. Yeah, that's a very good rule. Well done, Desco. I'm like, I have to caveat. I don't have a huge because I don't use I don't use GitHub for work, so I only use it for open source side projects. So I don't have a huge experience in configuring these kinds of rules, because I've not sort of done it in anger. Because at the time where I was doing heavy collaboration, GitHub didn't support any of this. That's sort of a fairly recent thing. Okay, so here's someone who's not one of the gatekeepers sent this pull request, and then was a bunch of discussion here. So they requested a review from a certain other person, and then there was one of the core team requested a change, and then the person sending the pull request addressed this change, and then there was an approval from one of the core team members, and then the pull request was merged. So this is kind of how a flow would go. Okay, let's see what the chat says. Jessica Joy Carr has a very good post against using pull requests on your team. Okay, interesting. I'm not familiar with the post, but I'll put it on my reading list. Right, so Juan, does this address your question? Okay, I suppose he's not here anymore. Right, what else do people find worth discussing? So maybe on collaboration workflows. So I guess back in the olden days, you could say, because I think now probably branch protection and going through pull requests, I would assume is probably the gold standard. But previously, what teams would have done is there's something called Git Flow. That was a popular. Sorry, I need to stop sharing and share another tab. Yeah, if you search for Git Flow, this is one of the first posts that comes up. It was suggested by someone called Vincent Friesen about, well, 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. Yeah, so this is like a fairly involved workflow where you have your main branch, and the rule of Git Flow is you like only releases are merged to your main branch, and everything else happens in separate branches. So if you want to work on, so there's a development branch, and most of the work happens off this develop branch, at the origin, I guess the main and the develop branch are the same, or like they fork off each other. But then when you do feature work, you branch off develop, and then you merge back into develop. And then when you want to create a new release, you do a release branch of develop, and only release branches are merged back into your main branch, and they are then tagged as releases. And of course, because you want the changes in your develop branch as well, when a release branch is finished, it's merged both into your main branch and tagged, the release is tagged, but then also back into your develop branch. So you have up-to-date changes. And the only other allowed workflow in this Git Flow model is a hotfix. And a hotfix is a small change that is directly off a release tag to address like a critical bug fix. And you merge this one directly back into your main branch with a new tag, and also in your develop branch. So like a hotfix branch can also have more than one commit. It's not just it doesn't have to be a single commit. Yeah, so that is kind of the Git Flow model. It's kind of fairly expensive. So like there's a bunch of tools around it. Like I think there's a Git Flow CLI tool that helps you with this a bit. So it's probably only worth it for fairly large projects, and in particular when you want to have this strict model of your main branch only having releases. So like, yeah, so in my opinion, it is a fairly well thought through model, but it has a lot of overhead for small projects and a small number of contributors. So I don't personally use it for any of my open source projects because it's too complex. And in fact, at this research project that I was showing you earlier, the model we used at the time was a pull request with Rebase Flow. So what we would do is we would issue a pull request. So we only had a main branch, and we were branching feature branches of a main branch, and then we would issue pull requests for review. But then when we merged them, we wouldn't create a merge commit, but we would rebase the branch. And the reason for this is to have sort of a clean history. And what a rebase does is essentially it takes all your changes and applies them on top of the most recent commit in your main branch. So it appears as if you had started the work of the latest version of the main branch, even though you may have started much earlier, but you're just like reapplying your changes continuously on top of the latest commit on your main branch. So I'm still kind of a fan of this flow because I like a clean history. Also, these days what I would probably advocate for, and you can do this with a standard GitHub pull request, and GitHub actually even supports this in the UI these days, is you squash changes. So you do a pull request, and then all the changes in this pull request, they are squashed together into a single commit, which is then applied on top of the latest commit of your main branch. And the reason for this is, if you wanted to undo a pull request, that's fairly easy because you just need to revert that single squashed commit, and it keeps that sort of your history clean, and it also, the granularity, if you will, like not sort of too small, because like Git of course encourages committing in very small increments, and I absolutely suggest you do that when you develop. But I think the history of your main branch should be curated, and I think squashing pull requests into a single commit is a good way of doing this. Of course, you can curate your history with rebases as well, but it's much more complex, and it may arguably not be worth the cost. Despo also suggests not branching off for too long. Small, more contained bits of work makes it easier. Absolutely, yes. So I think pull requests should be fairly small. Like I think in an ideal world, a feature should be the smallest incremental change that is sort of self-contained. So it should have like the code change, the documentation change, and the text, but in like a small increment. Pavel says, on our team we use trunk-based development with feature toggles. Yes. So that is another common workflow which big organizations use. It's in fact also what I use at work. So we have a monorepo. So everyone works on the same repository, and our commits essentially are similar to GitHub pull requests in the sense that they're one change, but you do them incrementally. Like you work on that change and then you send it for review. We call them change lists, and then you have a discussion. Like we also mandate code review, so you can never commit a change that hasn't been code reviewed, with a few exceptions. So like you can change documentation without having to go through code review if it's your own documentation. Because in our monorepo we also have a concept of ownership at the directory level. Let's maybe not go into that because it derails the discussion a bit. But yes, the way we then deal with how can you work on features incrementally is exactly what Pavel says. We use feature toggles or feature flag, as they're sometimes called. So you have a feature already in the code, but it's disabled, and then you can keep working on it, and then you can keep, like, for instance, when you're testing, when you build your code, you can enable that feature flag, so you can already test with your feature on, but for everyone else it's off. And then when your feature is sort of ready and has been tested and validated and all of that, you can switch the feature flag on. Another thing we do there is other mechanisms other than a commit to change the flag state. So we can do this via a dynamic configuration pushing mechanism. So if a feature is enabled in production, but it turns out to be causing an issue, we can do a very fast config change to disable the feature again. And we also roll features out gradually. So I think we're coming up on the end of the session. Do we have more questions and comments? This ended up going in a very different direction from what I anticipated. So I thought, like, okay, we would look at people's like recent stumbling blocks with Git, but I don't know, maybe people didn't have them or weren't quite comfortable sharing them. But hopefully this was still a useful discussion. Any last words from anyone before we close? Oh yeah, Pavel just posted a bunch of links. Yeah, so Pavel posted a link to the Git Hub Flow, which is actually it's a simplified version of the Git Flow. So the original Git Flow, I'll put the link in the chat. Thanks, Savannah. Good to hear that this was useful. Catherine asks, was GitHub Marketplace mentioned? No, we've actually not mentioned GitHub Marketplace. So yeah, maybe just for quick context, GitHub Marketplace is a way for you to share, well, for people and companies to share, I guess, services that work directly with GitHub. Like, for instance, we saw that on the branch protection settings in Firedrake that I showed you earlier, they required linting and so on. And the GitHub Marketplace has like integrations with like continuous integration, continuous deployment services, and things like that, which you can easily then add to your repos to enable these kinds of automated checks, which I would certainly recommend, like, as an additional safeguard to developers running tests manually. Thanks, everyone.